Eriel as we oh,
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things I just want to draw out here because first off, going back to this question of like, what can we learn from Indigenous peoples in addressing the climate crisis is I always say humility. Humility is one of the biggest things that we can learn from Indigenous communities. I remember growing up and the way in which we were taught things was to not center ourselves as being the best at something, but being humble enough to listen. And so Bio's comment of humble ourselves enough to fall down to the earth is so pertinent to me because it's like so, and it's relevant. I remember going out, my dad was teaching us how to track animals in the snow, and we were out walking, and I was just like, I was maybe 7 years old, and I'm like, well, what's that? What's that? Like asking all these questions every 5 minutes. And my dad just said, shh, just listen. And I'm like, listen to what? Like, I didn't know what I was listening to. And he's just like, just listen. And by the end of that year, when I'd go out with my dad, I didn't talk. I just listened. And I listened to the language of the land became something that was akin to my understanding of how I worked in relationship in the world. And that takes humility to understand that the verbal languages that we speak to each other are only one way of relating and being in relationship. And when it comes to how then do we learn this? Well, first off, we have in this society deep roots of not just colonialism and capitalism and patriarchy, but deep roots of white supremacy, deep roots of worship of the written word, hyper-individuality, and of course, in the face of climate change, Western science. But the reality is, as Indigenous communities, when you break it down to what we have been doing for thousands of years, is practicing forms of science. I was listening to a podcast the other day about nature-based solutions and carbon offsets because I work within the environmental movement. I understand climate science deeply. What is really challenging to me and frustrating to me as an Indigenous rights advocate working within this field is the fact that we are forced to understand the deep intricate understandings of Western science to participate in the conversations around the climate crisis and solutions when there is little of that same reciprocity given back to our communities. We have been participating in systematic reviews of all of the existing evidence around climate change for centuries. Uncle's story is that science is observation, and Indigenous peoples have been some of the best observers that have passed down our knowledge through generation, where we have been observing these ecosystems for thousands of years. And then we talk about science is about looking at systematic reviews, doing all of these experiments, and filling the gaps by doing research, tangible research. That tangible research is going out there, testing those waters, understanding and being in relationship with these spaces, and then bringing all the evidence together to create best practices and provide evidence for decision makers. These are the parameters for how we operate under Western science. But when Indigenous peoples do it in the ways that we have for thousands of years, it is not valued, it is not respected. We are told it's anecdotal, and we are told that it's not valid within these discussions. The same can be said for when we talk about how we interpret the solutions to the crisis. The solutions to the crisis are not stuck within these very narrow parameters because current Western science is narrow in scope because it doesn't have the same timelines that Indigenous science and knowledge has. And therefore, our solutions are much more broad and expansive because our timelines of understanding our relationships to these ecosystems and the natural world are not only driven by this narrow scope, but they're driven by a language that has been lost by humanity. This language that has been lost of humanity through systems of hyper-individuality, systems of colonialism, white supremacy, and at the hands of colonizers and settlers from European descent. And where did that come from? There's a really incredible I believe he was in your previous talks, Resma Menachem. He talks about how even the trauma of like settler white society comes from the traumas that they experience in themselves, and then the cycles continue. Just like, you know, my father who was beat in residential schools also hit us because that was a learned behavior, and so on and so forth. So we learn these behaviors through these traumatic like incidents that happen at some point somewhere along the line, and they keep cycling through. And we have this tremendous opportunity where we have so many indigenous cultures across the world that are reclaiming and saying, no, my culture, my language, my understanding, the value systems, the sciences, the governance structures, the education models, everything that we had for thousands and thousands and thousands of years is not demonized, is not devalued. And we're going to advance and push these things forward. And we're going to propose solutions that are outside the scope and the narrow parameters of colonial and Western science and ideologies and value systems. That requires us to not decouple and disembody ourselves from the climate crisis, but to place ourselves within these structures and systems, moving away from the mentality of scarcity to the mentality of abundance. We have to move the line forward, because in our communities, there is so much abundance. When you are taking the moose from the land and you leave that offering, there is reciprocity, there are circles. There are circles of lives where we retain that relationship and understanding that what I take, I have to give back. We are in relationship. And when we continue to be in relationship, you continue to see abundance. I want to read one small quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer because she's one of my favorite ethnobotanists, indigenous people in the world. But she said, to name the world as a gift is to feel one's membership in the web of reciprocity. It makes you happy and it makes you accountable. Conceiving of something as a gift changes your relationship to it in a profound way, even though the physical makeup of the thing has not changed. A woolly knit hat that you purchase at the store will keep you warm regardless of its origin. But if it was hand knit by your favorite auntie, then you are in relationship to that thing in a very different way. You are responsible for it, and your gratitude has motive force in the world. You're likely to take much better care of the gift hat than that of a commodity hat because it is knit in relationship. This is the power of gift thinking. I imagine if we acknowledge that everything we consume is the gift of Mother Earth, we would take better care of what we were given. Mistreating a gift has emotional and ethical gravity as well as ecological resonance. And our communities have lived in these reciprocity gift relationships. The story that Uncle said, you give your offering to the land so you can receive from the land. These are all gifts. You give a gift to receive a gift. And somehow our relationships change. And instead, we are focusing on solving this crisis as something that needs to be commodified and met within the capitalist structures. We cannot solve the climate crisis unless we solve the economic crisis. It's completely backwards. We need to be rebalancing ourselves and our relationships with the natural world and one another to move forward. And that takes humility. That takes saying that the structures that we have are not the only structures. This takes a tremendous amount of work towards working through decolonization, the deconstruction of something to make room for more. It is that reconnection to the natural living world and moving forward to peace and reciprocity and relationships of abundance. And there's so much to learn from Indigenous communities, and the amount that we can learn is tremendous. But when an elder once said, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, so we can listen twice as much as we speak.
Wow, thank you so much.